We're now moving on to our last group of speakers from the School of Psychology. So this is a team of 4, and so I'm really pleased to welcome today Karishma Beach, Chelsea Pickens, Sophie Sills and Lloyd Jones, who have been working for the past year, nearly a year actually, on a study looking at rape culture and social media with young people. So they're going to talk about one aspect of this work today, looking at social media activism and rape culture.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Nicola. So we're here today to talk to you guys a little bit about the research that we did last year as honours students, specifically on rape culture and social media. But before we begin, we'd just like to extend a huge thank you to all of our participants. Without them, this research really wouldn't have been possible. And would also like to thank everyone that worked on the project with us and that supported our endeavours. And I'd just like to say a special thank you to Nicola, Paulette and Octavia. So to start us off, this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'll briefly talk about what our research actually involved and hopefully provide some context as well. And then in terms of our findings, Chelsea will talk a bit about what we termed as a matrix of sexism, and then Karishma and Sophie will talk a bit about social media activism. So our research is heavily focused around the idea of rape culture. If you're not familiar with this term, it refers to the idea that our current cultural climate enables and perpetuates sexual violence. Essentially, it's the way that sexual violence is a normalized and almost accepted part of our lives. And I'm kind of just going to gloss over this because of time restrictions. There's a huge number of things that contribute to this. So for our audience members that aren't really familiar with this idea, hopefully Chelsea will provide some examples of this later on. So you could say that our research was really sparked by a rather well-known incident, which some have argued to be a particularly salient example of rape culture operating in New Zealand. And this was the Roastbusters case. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the Roastbusters case involved the investigation into a group of young men who would instigate sex with underage and intoxicated young women in ways that fit with definitions of gang rape and statutory rape. And there are certain things that happened during the publicity of this case that particularly exemplify the operation of rape culture in New Zealand. One example was when a rather prominent talkback radio host publicly questioned how free and easy the girls must have been, putting blame onto the girls, and also minimized the actions of the perpetrators to mischief. A particularly important component of the Roastbusters case was the use of social media. While all of this was happening, the group of boys who called themselves the Roastbusters publicly shared the identities of the victims over Facebook, and also publicly discussed rather intimate details of the girls on a social media site called Ask.fm. So some people have argued that social media in general is kind of a platform which can enable elements of rape culture, and that social media sites can replicate or even exaggerate the power structures that operate in offline spaces. So being the wonderful young researchers that we are, and also being quite active social media users ourselves, we were kind of aware of this manifestation of rape culture in online spaces. But we were, okay, yeah, they're quite funny. But we were also aware of some of the activism that is also made possible through social media. And as you can see, one example is in 2013, the Twitter hashtag safety tips for ladies started trending, which essentially is a collection of community-created ironic tips highlighting and exposing some of the victim-blaming attitudes around women's safety. And I actually searched this hashtag yesterday, and there are still posts coming through that are quite similar to this one. So this contrast between social media being both good and bad for gender politics is really where our research is based upon. So for our research, we interviewed young people to get a sense of their experiences with rape culture online. So we targeted participants who were particularly critical or uncomfortable with rape culture, as we wanted to get an in-depth look at the way that young people might use social media as a platform for activism. Just as a side note, while we talked to participants about their exposure and responses to rape culture, both online and offline, we found that in many cases, this distinction was kind of blurred, and our participants' experiences weren't so easily separated into online and offline categories. So the interviews were semi-structured and consisted of 3 major sections. Firstly, we talked to participants about their social media usage in general, and we used this social media map in the interviews to kind of prompt responses. And then we talked to participants about their experiences with encountering elements of rape culture online. And then finally, we talked to participants about either their knowledge or participation in resistance to rape culture through social media. So that's a rather brief run through of what our research involved. And now Chelsea is going to come and talk a little bit about some of our findings. Do you need this one? Yeah.
Is that loud enough? It's okay? Okay. Hello. So we'll be taking you through our findings. First of all, I'll talk a bit about the first part of our analysis, which we call the matrix of sexism. And then Sophie and Karishma will take you through the activism. Okay, so the first part of our analysis involves what we will refer to as a matrix of sexism. In response to questions about exposure, participants talked about several pervasive elements of rape culture. These appeared largely normalized and common within their social media interactions and experiences. Many conveyed a sense of living within an environment where sexism, misogyny, and rape culture were a normalized backdrop to everyday life. Or as one participant commented, much like a blanket of sexism. As we had specifically recruited for those critical of rape culture, many described instances where sexism seemed obvious to them, but appeared accepted and normalized by their peers and culture at large. Thus, a matrix-type analogy is here used to illustrate the way participants appear to see specific material as inherently contributing to and supporting rape culture. Yet they felt these underlying connections remained largely invisible and unquestioned to many of their peers. One participant illustrates this matrix idea through her comment, "Lots of people do think that rape culture doesn't exist, or that these things are just normal parts of life." So participants described a wide range of examples which contributed to this matrix of sexism. During our analysis, we grouped these examples into several key recognizable elements of rape culture, as you can see on the screen. So the first example, demeaning representations of women, was described as particularly pervasive to the point of unremarkable. The examples included things I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, such as the use of women as decorative and primarily sexual objects in such media as music videos and advertising. All the images that you'll see from here are screenshots that the participants all took. So another taken for granted example of rape culture was the routine celebration of male sexual conquest. Participants described this discourse as dominating certain types of media, such as popular TV shows and advertisements. Jamie describes this in her comments. Whenever there's a male protagonist to the story, there seems to be a girl that he's going after, as like something he wants instead of the girl actually being a person. Participants often described encountering victim-blaming attitudes online, especially in relation to the Roastbusters case or similar instances where women were essentially blamed for invoking or encouraging their own sexual attacks. Victim blaming appeared to work with slut shaming, where women were criticized for acting or dressing too sexual, controlling female sexuality and preparing the ground for blaming women for the sexual aggression against them, which you can see from these comments up there. A couple of participants cited celebrities or personalities who publicly shared these attitudes, such as Bindi Irwin, who publicly advised young women how to dress. Participants also described encountering aggressive or misogynist comments as a normal part of the online experience, particularly in comment sections on sites such as YouTube. Comments such as these, and some which were too offensive to put on a slide, not that these aren't offensive, were regularly encountered, often in response to feminist opinions. So I've had to run through these a little bit quickly. So look a little more in depth at the final example, rape language, and why this comparatively mundane part of the matrix can be problematic. So widespread and everyday uses of rape language were routinely reported in our study. Participants talked specifically about the way their peers would use the word rape to describe everyday acts of destruction or domination, such as, "Oh, this app is raping my battery," or this example by Claire. This use of rape language is a good example of a seemingly invisible matrix of sexism. As to many, the casual use of the word rape in contexts unrelated to sexual violence may not seem inherently sexist. Yet it can be argued that the casual desensitization of the word can contribute to a trivialization and normalization of the issue and experience. The use of rape language can also associate rape with a triumphant or positive act of power and domination. The use of rape jokes such as this can also arguably render rape as familiar, yet laughable, minimizing the act and potentially silencing victims. Throughout the interviews, participants explicitly described or more implicitly indicated a range of affective or behavioral responses that they had experienced as a result of viewing or engaging with this material. Many participants spoke about these examples of rape culture having a negative emotional impact on them. Descriptions of frustration, anger, and annoyance were particularly common. For example, several participants used the word angry in describing their reactions to the Roastbusters case. Many participants also used the word uncomfortable when referring to how this material made them feel, paired with comments of how gross or awful they found it. Some participants also described instances or material as damaging and explained that this had made them upset or sad. As well as emotional responses, several participants talked about responding to instances of rape culture with modifications to their behavior, usually to minimize the negative impacts or risks associated with rape culture. Many participants spoke of actively avoiding rape culture material, such as ceasing to visit sites or online spaces providing this. For example, the comment sections of YouTube videos. Some described their behavior as actively curbed by real-life encounters or cautionary tales of sexual threats and violence, thus policing women's behavior in the name of preserving their own safety. This included monitoring dress, avoiding strangers, not walking home alone at night, and carrying weapons. Though all the participants in our study were critical of rape culture, many also reported that sexist attitudes and aggressive comments worked to silence their critiques in a bid to avoid confrontation and criticism, much like Octavia was talking about before. Many described a reluctance to identify as feminist due to hostile and misogynist reactions. Taylor describes the silencing succinctly regarding her attempts at feminist critiques of online material. I tried commenting once. It didn't go down very well. I don't comment anymore. But while rape culture had the power to silence and cause negative emotional and behavioral impacts, it's not all bad, as Karishma will explain.
Hi. So now Sophie and I are going to talk a bit about feminist activism on social media. So as Lloyd and Chelsea just highlighted, social media is not exempt from replicating the power dynamics that exist in offline spaces. But our participants also emphasized the role of social media as a key site of feminist activism, particularly among young feminists. Our participants discussed several key areas of feminist activism that have arisen on social media, one of which was feminist education. Social media was often described as a really powerful platform that could be used to raise awareness and educate people about feminist issues. Here are some extracts that illustrate this, but I'm not actually going to read them because I don't have time, but I'll just leave them there for you guys to look at. So one thing that's really interesting about these extracts is the way Jyoti describes online activism as often being picked up by osmosis, and offers the example of their sister. So this kind of shows how people who are coming across this feminist or social justice material aren't necessarily deliberately seeking it out in order to become educated on these issues. They might just happen to see this material online and they read it and learn about it in a really effortless sort of way. So in this way, it's able to educate and raise awareness among many different types of people who might not otherwise ever see those kinds of alternative viewpoints. And as exemplified in this extract, our participants described a certain kind of feminist material that's more likely to become popular on social media. This sort of content appeals to young people and is written in the kind of language that can be understood by teenagers, even though it might be rooted in quite complex theory. And this content spreads rapidly because it is relatable and it doesn't feel like education, which really highlights why social media may be such an effective form of education among young people. And here on this slide, I have some screenshots that participants took, which are 3 separate examples of the kind of feminist material that might be seen on social media. So I'll just give you a few seconds to look at that. We have an image there on the left which was taken from Tumblr, which challenges victim-blaming attitudes around rape. The posts on the right are text posts about feminism, also taken from Tumblr. And Tumblr is a popular blogging site that's able to host a range of content from text to pictures, videos, and audio, etc. And down the bottom, as I've circled in red, are the notes. So you can see that the image at the top has over 150,000 notes, meaning that over 150,000 people have interacted with that post, either through liking it or reposting it onto their own blogs. So in addition to feminist education, our participants also discussed the importance of social media in building alternative virtual communities. Participants described Tumblr as an example of a social media site that was particularly good at fostering safe spaces for marginalized groups and building feminist communities. This accessibility and safety for diverse feminists was considered to be of great importance in online community building. For example, as we see in these extracts, our participants emphasized that in these virtual communities, feminism is not just about combating sexism. Considerations of racism, heterosexism, and cissexism are also considered to be of vital importance within feminism. And social media was regarded as a really helpful tool for this purpose. So Ivy and Jyoti described Tumblr as being powerful because it has the ability to provide new and subversive forms of representation, which challenge the norms and power relations of mainstream society. It's also said to offer a safe space which is accessible to diverse people, where marginalized people can feel free to express thoughts that might not be considered acceptable in most places, such as Jyoti's example, I'm tired of white people. These spaces can therefore provide a reprieve from the power imbalances that pervade society. The formation of these safe spaces and communities is also regarded as a form of activism, as it allows individuals to be themselves and to learn from and educate one another and share in each other's diverse experiences. And now I'm going to hand you over to Sophie, who's going to talk about how our participants actively sought change.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Up the pack? Okay. So the resistance that these young people brought to us was pretty broad. So as Karishma showed us, it often incorporated feminist learning or building safe spaces and communities. But it also included some more direct forms of seeking change. And in many ways, activism for our participants was about coping with the constant barrage of sexism in their daily lives, And so it included almost anything that showed sexism was not just being put up with. So up on the screen here, I have an example from a Tumblr called When Women Refuse, where people can submit stories of violence against women who say no. So many participants showed us examples like this that were blogs or websites where social media users could gather stories or pictures or examples, things like that, that sort of documented the rape culture and the sexism that they were putting up with. So in some other examples, one participant started what they termed a media roundup, in which she collected all the online articles about the Roastbusters in one place on Facebook. So another participant showed us instances of negative comments being posted onto feminist Facebook pages, and then having some feminists or some other young people rebutting these comments directly. And we also had several participants showed us parody videos of Blurred Lines, Robin Thicke's questionable song. Others showed us petitions that they had signed and then posted onto their Facebook pages. Or they showed us magazines that they had made. And they even showed us sarcastic charts plotting Republican attitudes towards rape. So their broad online activism was about coping, but this wasn't the end of the story. It was also about retaking their public space and being a knowing user of social media. So participants discussed a concept which one termed trial by internet. And this represented an attitude where problematic behavior could be captured and documented and then posted online. So simply by knowing their way around social media, these young people could wield the new public power that isn't usually available to us in our youth. So as Jyoti described, trial by internet is still accessible to a lot of us, and that's a lot of what keeps us safe. I've known parents who literally have stopped hitting their kids because their kids will put it on Facebook. Or, as Ivy said, I've seen quite a few spaces for calling out sexism, and they keep the name of the perpetrator in there to protect other women. Sexism has real meaning, especially if a lot of people are paying attention to what you're saying. So I think they do deserve to be called out. So, as in these examples, participants portrayed the vastly public nature of social media as a benefit that meant people could be held accountable for problematic behavior and attitudes. So in this sort of vein, one participant told us a story of how she utilized Facebook to get justice in the wake of her own sexual assault. So she contacted the perpetrator and told him that he had to make an announcement on his Facebook page admitting what he had done. So Ruby explained that she took this course of action because she did not think that the legal system would take her side. She was intoxicated at the time of her assault, and so she assumed that she would be blamed. She did not reveal this to the perpetrator, however, and she explained that he complied because she threatened legal action. So Ruby made him leave the post up for several weeks, and she said her desired outcome was for him to admit what he had done and for everyone to shun him socially. So this example really captures the knowing and informed utilization of power that these young people saw as activism, or their trial by internet. However, the response that Ruby received wasn't exactly as she'd hoped. Many of the perpetrator's friends blamed Ruby and then made excuses for her assaultant's actions. So therefore, this form of social media activism wasn't perfect necessarily, and in many instances, this trial by internet could not overcome the pervasiveness of rape culture and this vast matrix of sexism that these young people were putting up with. But it also wasn't all bad news. Our participants' stories and the range of examples that they showed us spoke to the possibilities for activism that are accessible to young people. So the matrix of sexism took away a lot of their power in many situations, but social media was sort of a place in which they could begin to get this back. So In conclusion, our young people depicted a broad and inescapable system of sexism, and the impact of this on their emotions and their well-being was notably harmful. However, through educating themselves, through carving out safe spaces and communities, and through trial by internet, they are slowly taking back their power and their right to space in the public domain. So I just want to end on a sort of personal note. When I wrote my dissertation on modern feminism, I took the stance that this kind of activism might be too neoliberal to be effective. So commenting back or documenting rape culture seemed too individual and too focused on the idea that everyone must fend for themselves and be responsible for their own empowerment. But after revisiting this material with the others for the talk, I find it is particularly important to emphasize how the matrix of sexism colored the participants' talk. So every time they talked to us about activism, they really emphasized this pervasive system of sexism that they were constantly putting up with. So thus, we feel that rather than seeking individual empowerment, these young people spoke of a social media world which enabled the matrix of sexism to be pushed back one small battle at a time by like-minded communities of people equipped with generations of feminist rhetoric. Thank you.
Kia ora. I kind of have a two-pronged response, but the first point does lead into the second one, so bear with me. Given that half of all trans women are sexually assaulted in their lives, how do you justify the decision not to include any among your research participants? And then moving along from that, how do you respond to the role of social capital in trial by internet? So I'm thinking specifically about the use of social media to organise trans extermination as radical feminism, like Gender Identity Watch is a popular one on Twitter, or there's Kathy Brennan and her general career. But how do you respond to the role that structural privilege can play, even in online spaces?
We had a transgender participant who identified as transmasculine. We were open to all participants, but we kind of just got what we could get. Whoever responded to our sort of advertisements all over social media. But yeah, that's just who happened to respond. Yeah. Do you want to take the second part?
Take the second part. Yeah. Yeah. So we just sort of let people come as they came to us, really. But yeah, in terms of what you're saying about yeah, I guess we could only sort of take what we were given in that sense. Sorry, everyone. But yeah, definitely we have to recognise that there can be some awful things happening on Tumblr and on social media, just as there can be some positive things happening. And so we had a little bit of that coming through as well, but especially for the talk and sort of being at the end of the day, we didn't want to really, bring in the all the negative stuff so much, and just sort of show what could really be possible for young people. And sometimes I think young people get a bad rap, and we get seen as, not really doing stuff sometimes, and I too sort of had that view. So I think that it's important that we sort of present sort of the possibilities and the range of ideas that young people are having, and what's coming through is really positive. So yeah, but thank you.
I was interested in your talk about space and creation of communities, and I guess one of the things I was interested in is if any of the young people talked about how it is that they found spaces. Is that some of the young people I've talked to about have found it difficult to find the kinds of spaces that they want, and others seem to have more strategies. And did they talk about that and what kind of strategies they used?
It's a bit of a debate between us on who's going to answer. No, I think definitely we had some of the material coming through. It's been a while since we've looked at the data, so potentially I can't remember as much of it probably as I should, but I'd say that with the space and community type of thing, it's definitely, as Karishma pointed out in her dissertation, Tumblr seemed to be a really good place for it, potentially because of the way that you can sort of filter who's coming into your space and who's not coming into your space. But yeah, that's about all I can say to it. But I think definitely. Anyone wanna?
And a lot of the participants we talked to who are like involved in feminist communities and stuff like that on Tumblr and elsewhere sort of mentioned coming across it kind of by accident and just kind of getting pulled into that just by chance, not necessarily going out looking for those kinds of communities. Yeah.
First of all, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. Something that I really struggle with is when you're trying to be active online on Facebook and express some feminist views or try and engage people of our age in opinions that they might not be familiar with. Do you have any advice about how not to be a target for being a killjoy or for tainting people's Facebook threads with stuff they don't want to hear about? How can we engage people without getting that attitude?
I don't think I really have any particular advice for that on Facebook. A lot of our participants, I think Facebook is quite like a personal page. Like you have your people that you know in real life. Like that's what we got from our interviews anyway, that Facebook's more like people who you know. So it kind of depends on what people you surround yourself with, I suppose. But a lot of the time, I don't think there's too much of a way to avoid that. Do you have any advice, So?
Pick your battles, really.
Yeah, pick your battle, she says. Or try some of Octavia's strategies.
What I tend to do, because a lot of my friends on Facebook are feminists, I just sort of post something and just leave it. And then if people have negative comments or remarks, I just don't engage and I just keep posting the things I want to promote as the feminist stuff. And somebody might see it, somebody might learn something, who knows.
Did you speak to any participants who expressed the idea of online activism as a form of, I guess, a deflection of political energy, like the whole keyboard warrior thing, and the fact that I don't know so much about Tumblr, but definitely Facebook seems to have kind of a thing about social reward and gratification, getting likes and that sort of stuff, and a lot of those are going to come from peers and people in positions of traditional privileged backgrounds are going to get like-minded or like backgrounded people supporting that. Did you have interviewees who kind of expressed doubts about that?
There was actually, Lloyd's dissertation looks at that a bit with males posting feminist stuff and some female feminists sort of feeling as though they were doing that just for the gratification of being the good male. That Lloyd can probably tell you more about that if you want to.
Yeah, there's not much really to add to that. Yeah, like you said, there is, from the kind of focus that I took from our research, there definitely was that kind of existence of, especially males, kind of using like a feminist label to like gain popularity or likes and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know how to answer your question. Sorry.